Okay, so this is the fifth lecture, and this takes us to now pages 35 through 44. And we're going to pick up here by talking about Hobbes again. So, not only is it wrong to call human beings in nature miserable in some metaphysical way, it's also because they didn't have words, after all. So we don't want to anachronistically attribute a linguistic condition to them. The other thing you could say is that it's wrong now, as Hobbes did, to call them evil because they were ignorant of the good. Rousseau thinks, by contrast, that um, these early people were um, equally ignorant of vice. They didn't know virtue, but they didn't know vice either. Right? So that's a crucial point to take away. What would it mean not to know vice? Well, it would mean not to know all the bad things that you can do to yourself in society. And so they might not have known what was good. They might have been ferocious or strange beings. But just by being ignorant of all the bad things that come from society, they would have been in a much better condition than Hobbes imagines. The other problem that Hobbes couldn't quite figure out was the influence of natural pity. So there is ardent interest in self-preservation to the point of ferocity on the part of human beings, Rousseau says. But there's a tempering of that ferociousness by natural pity, which is in society today almost totally deranged. But it's not totally gone either. Natural pity still lingers on. He points out, for instance, in a famous passage on page 37, that even today, when people go to the theater, they weep. They see some imaginary tragedy and they get caught up in it emotionally, and it elicits their natural pity. But for Rousseau, again, this is a somewhat ironic comment, because basically he's saying that people are so depraved that they can cry at that sort of thing, but then they don't actually feel pity towards real human suffering. And he thinks that's because of reason and philosophy. Philosophy and reason are heavily indicted in this passage on 37 and 38. He says, philosophy is what isolates man and what moves him to say in secret, perish if you will, I am safe and sound. It breaks down our bonds of solidarity with other human beings that existed in nature, our pity for others. He says, no longer can anything but danger to the entire society trouble the tranquil slumber of the philosopher and yank him from his bed. His fellow men can be killed with impunity. Underneath his window, he has merely to place his hands over his ears and argue with himself a little in order to prevent nature, which rebels within him, from identifying him with the man assassinated. The savage man does not have this admirable talent, Rousseau says, ironically, right? Because it's not admirable. He's being sarcastic. Savage man does not act like this. He's not as depraved as the philosopher, this figure of civilization and of progress and the Enlightenment and that sort of thing. Okay. Now, pity, on the other hand, is the crucial term here, in contrast to Hobbes. Hobbes is too one-sided in his view of human beings and nature. They always fight, they never flee. They're only interested in themselves, they have no pity. Rousseau's trying to fill out the portrait, provide shading on the other side, cooperation, connectedness, solidarity would have been there in nature too, as well as ferocious, ardent self-interest. Now, on 39, Rousseau begins a discussion of sexuality in human beings. And basically what he's trying to point out is that there's a fundamental difference between human beings and other animals when it comes to sexuality. What is it? It's a physical thing, and it's basically the fact that in human females, there's no period of exclusion or heat in which the males can't have access to the females. And for animals means that all of their life is organized around the period of time in which females accept males, and the species can be perpetuated. Human life is fundamentally different than this. There is no period of exclusion. There's no sexuality in that instinctual mode. Sexuality is fundamentally distinct for human beings. It's not limited or constrained by these natural dynamics. Human beings can pursue sexuality as animals do. They cannot pursue it at all. But there's no examples of animals that don't pursue it at all, right? There's only kind of human beings living in these cultural and civilizational conditions that they can pursue chastity or take vows of celibacy or something like that. Now, there's one other animal now that we can show that is like us in this way. There's no heat in the females, and that's the pygmy chimpanzee or the bonobo. And they are like human beings, these very interesting creatures when it comes to sexuality. And you guys can learn about bonobo through YouTube or something like that if you want to go into it further. Okay. So that's it for part one. What we've gotten from this passage, I hope, is a portrait of human life before language, before property, before monogamy and family. Human beings, in some sense, paused, stalled out in natural conditions for eons, with no way of advancing forward. Even if some few human beings, very wily, creative figures, figured out a bunch of stuff and made advances, they could have been very easily just swept away by some kind of environmental change or difference, and all their enlightenment would die with them. So there's no yet, in some sense, meaningful historical progress on the order, let's say, of the Bronze Age, early Chinese civilization or something like that. There's no meaningful technical developments for many eons to come. Instead, man in nature is permanently stalled out there, living amongst ecological richness, relatively isolated, and very importantly, a free being, a free human being in nature. Okay, that's Rousseau. Okay, we'll come to part two next week. Good luck with your papers.